Among many concepts out there that serve to polarize our psyche, none is as deep and as perplexing as the concept of good and evil. Perplexing because from the point of view of non-duality, or even if we are to speak from the point of view of many religions, monistic religions that is, if God is all that there is, then how can there be evil in this world? Hence, the attitude towards what constitutes evil has existed since the time immemorial, and we can trace that to the very archaic times, to the so-called pre-religious times, certainly to the times before the arrival of great religions that are dominating the world today when it comes to the revelation of this or that tongue of the prophet. So this concept of evil throughout cultures, ages, and various religions is a very poignant one. What also is very interesting is that the question of evil is left open to linger. In other words, none of the religious revelations, none of the religious truths has given us a decisive answer in its stand or stance on what constitutes evil and how to reconcile evil with that what could be understood here as nothing other than the essence of all beings, that is, the divine essence of all. So our reflections, loosely titled Beyond Good and Evil, as that tribute to Friedrich Nietzsche, or rather Friedrich Nietzschean line, unfolds and could be seen in line with the previous reflections on the state of affairs in the world, where we know that we will be misunderstood. We will be perhaps judged by the lack of taking a moral stand on the current situation in the world. This is, of course, because it's very nuanced and extremely subtle and delicate topic that we are trying to address here. The perspective that we speak from is not new. This perspective is as ancient as the world itself. This perspective is not rooted in somehow absolving oneself from any sense of emotional or psychological involvement in what is happening in the world today. Contrary to that, our heart is swelled in partaking and witnessing how a lot of innocent lives perish in this, what is plainly spoken by all parties and all points of view, as yet another horror driven by geopolitical consensus. So we will speak to that and reflect on the place of that concept. For good and evil is a necessary universal concept, alas often used for various personally driven motivations, and above all else for polarizing and dividing purposes, which has at its goal to justify the means of those who have or could be seen as one way or another responsible for enticing this particular conflict that we are now all partaking in very much, because that's the focal point of attention of all mainstream media, or any other conflict which is raging right now on the globe. Because let us also face the reality that, in the words of Noam Chomsky, there are worthy and unworthy cases, so to speak, spoken in parentheses, when it comes to where do we shed light, on which part of the world, and whose people and which nations would we give that justification in the righteous outrage when it comes to the atrocities that every military conflict is inseparable from. So, what is evil and what is good here? For that we will turn our attention again to some of the perennial wisdom traditions, namely the portion of the Mahabharata. The Bhagavad Gita states very clearly, I think it's the chapter 8 that speaks of the relationship of the good and evil, or rather what is evil in this world, concluding that all creation is a mixture of good and evil, which is a very important thesis to apply here. That if we somehow immediately take the position which withdraws us from any necessity of self-introspection and taking ourselves in the complexity of the picture and how we constitute the totality, that our part in it is inseparable from what is happening, then we are only adding to that what constitutes evil. In other words, each time we point out our finger that that and that, so and so, is evil, we making evil smile in its place, smile in rejoicing that it's succeeded in terms of what the evil here represents. For forgive me in my blatant way of observing that what is more evil, the open conflict or being behind, enticing that conflict in variety of very cowardly ways. It's open to polemics, open to sincere and honest investigation, at the very least. So, what can we take out of that reconciling line of the Bhagavad Gita, that all creation is a mixture of the both? And this is squarely related to the way the collective and individual are not mutually accepting notions. In fact, these are utterly and entirely interdependent realities. There is no collective without an individual, and there is no individual without the collective. Both, speaking from that still dualistic perspective, because it will be helpful now for us to unravel this, or at least to get an additional insight, that what constitutes here me, that internal perspective of the one who has this existential outlook, and them, that what I perceive out there, out of my own identity of this being so-and-so, are not independent realities. The whole channel's purpose of this particular work is dedicated to bringing these reminders over and over towards the utter and entire unity of all things. So this collective and individual as mutually interdependent concepts cannot be viewed in the safety of the armchair. This is also must be viewed on any battlefield. Certainly when it comes to the battlefield of opinions perspectives and ideologically preferred points of view that collide as they come face to face in a very explosive manner as we are witnessing it right now. So, when it comes to these reflections on what constitutes good and evil, we also often hear a certain stance taken towards certain individuals which historically represented the very lines that, at least in terms of the political stand of this or that nation, would be embodied by a particular living being, a particular human. So it's hardly surprising that in today's reality of the war that everyone speaks about right now, there is already that epithet strongly being labeled at a particular individual so as to pinpoint where exactly the evil is. So in other words, when we hear that kind of conversation at the kitchen sink, or even in the podcasts by political commentators, let alone news channels who are all biased by the parties and the interests of those they serve, and whose paycheck they cash when it comes to the household affairs of their own reality, we may not really find this disturbing. But when a spiritual teacher, when a scholar begins to use these labels by calling a leader of this country or that country an asura, this is when one needs to be more attentive, because this is indeed a gravely sign that we are in for some serious mess, some serious confusion, which is now being added in the name of spiritual integrity. And this is why I felt it's very important that we separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to who is evil here. Is it possible that a human being can be a manifestation of the evil forces in this world as we speak, even if there are a heap of evidence, a heap of documented every hour of what is being happening on the battlefield as we speak? So, in order for us to continue with these reflections, I would like to bring this very important Vedic concept on the relationship between governing bodies of any kind and a collective state of affairs. So in other words, a governing body of any nation, be they an enlightened king or a tyranny, is nothing but an expression of the collective state of consciousness. This is a very timeless reminder. Why? Because for the past several years I have witnessed how in the midst and in the wake of many electoral debates in rising of this or that power in this or that country, these conversations have been always veered towards somehow less poignant angle of where and how a governing body of any nation can rise to power. Whereas I would advise everyone to look into the work of, let's say, someone like Dr. David Frawley, an eminent Vedic Pandit, who is heralded in India as a white sage, that kind of nickname that he was dubbed with among the scholars of that country with great respect. And a particular work of his, which is, by the way, lesser known than his contribution to Ayurveda, and a book known as Kings and Sages, which weaves that connection between the body of the nation in terms of the leader of that nation and the state of collective consciousness, how one is the result of the other. So from that point of view, there are no good or bad rulers. There are no good or bad presidents, monarchs, or dictators. They are simply a reflection of that where the nation is when it comes to the consciousness of that nation, when it comes to the collective level of awareness of that nation. Yes, many people would prefer to dismiss that, many people would prefer to cover this argument with gazillion of counter-arguments that but, and so, oh, but what about this and that? What about, let's say, mingling in the electoral process of this country? How about if this is done by the involvement of the CIA or the KGB or whatever we may here find as a useful abbreviation of this or that organization? This makes no difference. Whatever is the outcome of a person, certain individual rising to the very top, it is because certain very subtle processes are at work, always at work. And when that happens, anything that is being done at the so-called cosmetic level of procedures, cosmetic here would mean that moving the chairs on the Titanic, as they say, or trying to implement this or that procedure to change the power, change the ruling body for a better government, for a better party, for a better individual. All this is in vain unless the consciousness of the nation has been uplifted. So, yes, I'm speaking about this, just making sure if it's recorded. I'm speaking about this also from the years of what I have received as deemed precious gift of the teachings of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, where he stated and reinstated this again and again, how important it is to make sure that there are groups of people continuously involved in advanced spiritual practices. Not just spiritual practices, how they are understood by common folk, but spiritual practices which have a vertical dimension to them, not just horizontal level of, let's say, intention setting or the prayer-based attitude towards begging the Almighty to interfere. No, we're speaking about here vertical technologies of consciousness aimed at accessing that finest level of reality from where everything rises to the field of potentiality, embedded with all possibilities at all times, and bringing spontaneously to the surface level of affairs all that what could be considered as pure gold, what could be considered as the purity upon which the action naturally based on. Not only those who are partaking in these spiritual methodologies as they go about this, but what's more importantly, as the byproduct of their practice which spills over, which creates that possibility where a common folk can partake in that natural frothing over, spilling over of that, what this particular methodology can afford. So, what is this reality is based on, or what is this proposition is based on? Again, we will dive into perennial wisdom traditions for this perspective that human being is not just somehow an accident of evolution, let alone a solitary affair in the kingdom of creation. But human being is in fact, could be seen as the evolutionary field where certain processes can take place. And these processes can take place only in the physicality of being human and nowhere else. So, for those of you who are less familiar maybe with this perspective, there is this notion of different realms which we can find echoed in many, many different cultures and many different traditions. Different realms. Just as in Christianity there are different realms, in Judaism and Islam there are different realms of heaven. From this physical plane of reality, as it goes into subtler and subtler dimension, there are realms of various angelic beings. Likewise, at the lower strata of creation, there are different realms below the level of human, which are the worlds of lesser evolved beings. And in this so-called hierarchy of different realms of creation, the only place available for evolution is the field of human consciousness, for which the human body is a must. So in other words, if we are to speak now using that more veered towards Vedic and Tantric perspectives, the worlds of devas and asuras, just as there are many, many other realms of which we spoke in one of our recent videos, when we have mentioned that there are different realms where consciousness is in a certain state of liveliness, let's say from a rock, where the unit of liveliness is at its minimum, and all the way to the perfection of being, going through various different stages in that hierarchy of creation, where human being takes a particular position, we could say perhaps somewhere in the middle. And it is in the human realm where a status quo can be challenged, a status quo can be changed. In the realm of devas, the so-called divine shining beings, it is fixed. Likewise, in the realm of asuras, the realm of these negative demonic beings, it is fixed. They cannot transgress nor digress in their evolution, because evolution is not available in that more fixed realm. They would need to partake in the human birth to either continue their evolution or to bring about some qualitative changes. At least this is a Vedic perspective which is also shared in Tantra. So these divine and demonic realms, they inhibit a specific strata of creation. And in speaking in more kind of, let's say, currently preferred acceptable language, these realms can also be seen as realms of the macro and microcosmos, of which we human beings, of course, stand in the middle, where us is the balancing act between the two, the realm of the macrocosm and the microcosm. So we can also speak about it from the perspective of downright neurophysiology. The whole nervous system can be seen as the realm where at the subtle level all these different beings, taking their respective areas of governance, their respective areas of whereabouts. So we have in our own neurophysiology a realm of the devas and the realm of the asuras. Each human being here is a conglomerate, a gathering place, an assembly of these beings, divine and demonic. What makes it fascinating and what opens this into a possibility, that it is here and nowhere else that these forces can come face to face in that, often also spoken as that final hour of the challenge, where the victory is what assures the evolutionary outcome of any of its processes. So this yes, it can be spoken of as pan-Indian perspective, which, as I said earlier, can also be found maybe in lesser acuity, in less literal manner, but certainly echoed throughout many other cultures, not just in great religions. We can find these allusions in many pagan cultures. We can find allusions in more ancient forms of spirituality, where that collision between forces of light and forces of darkness, which saves the day when it comes to the drama of being human. So this battle for the human soul is not being held purely in terms of individual responsibility. And this is where the polymaths and great sages of the past, such as often aforementioned and often spoken and brought as an example by us recently, Sri Aurobindo speaks in his letters on yoga, in his integral theory of understanding of all this cosmic codependence. He speaks about it from the perspective of how this, what the battle represents, is not down to the individual state of affairs. Some intervention must take place. In other words, these greater forces, this, perhaps we can speak about it as the descending light of grace, is required to play a decisive role when it comes to the rise of a human being to his rightful status. And certainly, we could also conclude, and I think Sri Aurobindo does address this quite directly in terms of the involvement of the Asuric field, Asuric realm, in the lives of human beings by messing around with human psyche. And there are times when certain human beings become literally a playground of these forces. So in other words, this is universal concept. The universal concept of good and evil here is seen from the perspective of how these forces meet face to face in each and every one of us, perhaps in some in a more acute manner compared to others. But certainly that drama plays itself out. And yes, indeed, there is a possibility where certain human beings come into this world out of necessity to support the evolutionary flow as that incarnation of the divine quality. This is not only true to the Mahavatar concept, again born on Indian subcontinent, where each evolutionary stage and phase is reassured in its steadfastness by this or that incarnation of a divine principle comes here to make sure that evolution is constantly being trajected towards that what here is spoken about over and over again as regaining its true status. And in the same way, this Asuric realm, also these demonic beings can reincarnate in the realm of human beings to pursue their deeds. But this should not be seen immediately as utterly and entirely negative, because it is precisely where they are opened to a possibility of taking a different turn in their own evolution, as it were. And there are examples in the scriptures where such cases took place, how, let's say, the author of a great epic in India, Valmiki, was a notorious gangster and a bandit who was just robbing and killing people left, right, and center until he was initiated by a sage and fallen into deep meditation, which resulted in him being motionless for so long that termites built a house around his body. Hence the very name, Valmiki, the hill, the the ant hill, or termite hill. So this Valmiki became a great sage. The transformation of his consciousness was complete and utter and entire. So, where does this take us from here? Another important reflection here perhaps would be the reminder that good and evil are not static concepts. I wouldn't go as far as to say that they are interchangeable concepts, but maybe they are. However, and no matter how paradoxically this sounds, that very notion that the end justifies the means is being also used here by divine forces whenever the need arose. Thus, I'll give you an example, again borrowed from the aforementioned Mahabharata, where Krishna himself urges Yudhishthira, who is the son of Dharma, therefore the most righteous among all the Pandavas, among all the men, to speak lies so as to undermine the morale of the enemy by declaring that son of Drona, Ashwatthama, is dead. And of course this causes great conflict for Yudhishthira, who cannot see any good in speaking lies, obviously because the moral compass of that man is steadfasted by the DNA of his father being nothing other than Dharma itself. And yet, of course, as the story goes, one of the Pandavas, Bhima, kills an elephant who carries the same name, Ashwatthama, and therefore that will be a white lie when they all shout, Ashwatthama is dead, Ashwatthama is dead. And Yudhishthira is being forced to lie and to say that to Drona, that Ashwatthama is dead. And when he opens the mouth to say that which Ashwatthama is dead, we know that Krishna blows his conch so as to make sure Drona does not hear the rest of the story. And as the story goes, Drona, who was the greatest warrior and whose position in the battlefield of Kurukshetra was decisive, now completely undermined by receiving the news of the death of his son, kills himself or allows himself to be killed, depending on which storyline you would prefer to take. This, of course, gives us this almost perplexing message that the Bhagavad Gita here sends, that in order to preserve Dharma, Dharma is being violated. We also know that later on in the Mahabharata, there will be a price that Pandavas will have to pay. And Yudhishthira himself would also have to go through certain ordeal of the so-called last judgment before he will attain the supremacy of that immortality when faced with the Lord of Death, Yama, precisely because of encumbering this sin or the karma of not truly staying with the reality of it all and allowing the lie to slip through him. But what it also gives us, an important understanding and perhaps immediate reflection on, but what then constitutes good and how good differs from evil, which we can naturally here arrive at the conclusion that anything that promotes and steadfasts evolution could be considered as in line with goodness and goodness itself. And anything that impedes evolution and aims at remaining in a status quo, opposing that flow of transformation, is by necessity becomes evil. I think it's worthy concept to ponder on whenever it comes to what we are faced with, each and every one of us individually here in our own domain. So what this has to do with individual stand and individual tendencies in the sense of this divine order, and how all this relates further with regard to the evolution. How can this evolutionary flow can unfold, and what are the mechanics of this evolution, aside from the aforementioned necessity for the intervention of grace. This is where a very useful concept of the forces of nature can be borrowed again, because it's that indispensable aspect of Indian philosophy which is being utilized by all systems and all teachers of that particular culture. It is the concept of the Gunas, the forces of nature, the forces of light and equilibrium as found in Sattva Guna, the forces of desire, passion and action, and all that has to do with motion as the domain of Raja Guna, and that what here represents stupor, that what represents here inertia, but also structure, also that what represents here the very morbidity and the inertia of the body, if it's not enlivened, is represented by tamaguna or tamas. So this is what is very important here, because in the process of overcoming one's lower nature, the role of Sattva Guna is proverbial, because without the degree and amount of Sattva Guna, the transformation of consciousness into high order is simply impossible, because we are already subjected by tamaguna by virtue of being embodied. Body itself is an expression of tamaguna. But that is okay, because that's when it comes to the bodily structure, as long as Tamaguna doesn't touch our subtler realm of our emotions, feelings, and thoughts. Rajaguna here is an expressive potentiality of our senses. Senses are rajasic by their very nature, whereas the quality of our mind is in its natural state sattva. Therefore, this is a very important realization that mind in its natural state is nothing other than that what reflects our essential nature. When all the frequencies and vrittis subside, mind reflects the essence of who we are, just as the still surface of the ocean or the pond reflects full moon. So this importance of sattva here as that leverage, without which the human effort seems to be futile. And although the Bhagavad Gita itself speaks that, Nistrai guna bhav Arjuna, be without the three gunas, O Arjuna. Go beyond the domains of the three gunas. It is the sattva guna that creates the possibility and predisposition for the light of awareness to shine forth on its own accord unimpededly. So in other words, the sattva guna here is of special importance, because sattva guna naturally and spontaneously brings about the desired state in the neurophysiology, which with time can begin to reflect the light of its own awareness naturally, organically, and spontaneously. And therefore it is spoken of as the closest to Brahman, the closest to the Absolute. So this concept of, and the place and the role that the interaction of gunas plays in that whole drama of creation, and how all of us are subjected to these forces of nature, and the necessity therefore to build up that content of sattva is paramount for the success in any spiritual overtaking of one's lower nature. Because what here acts as that what reassures the immobility and remaining in the status quo is the quality of tamaguna. So if the tamaguna here would be spoken in terms of its quality in relation to tendencies, then it can be spoken as that evil tendency which acts against our higher purpose, against our higher self. So the overcoming of that lower nature here in itself brings about the spontaneous rise of that innate knowledge which paves the way to transcending the very concept and the notion of good and evil. This, what served us along the way, will become of no use. That final polarity between good and evil has its sway and place only upon that when that naturally has been transcended. When these notions naturally been transcended by each and every one of us, by virtue of embodying grace in its fuller measure, which also could be spoken in terms of in its relation to the quality of sattva, that naturally brings the that simply makes the concepts outlived notions and no longer serve anything. What also feels fitting to add here is that model of the modes of conduct that a human being here subjected to. The first mode of conduct is individual, driven by personal preferences, motivations and desires. The second, in that rise of one's awareness, is the interest of collective. So this is where the necessity of law and order comes into play, the so-called yamas and niyamas and the commandments, and the necessity for recognizing that the collective good is greater than the satisfaction of personal desires. Then still higher up in the hierarchy of its unfoldment is the right ethical attitude, which in this case heralds the unfoldment of individual to an independent status. Individual is ripe and evolved enough to take the stand outside even of the collectively shared consensus, simply driven by that very strong moral concept which is steeped in the highest good, such as love, compassion, and righteousness from the point of view of that ethic. So it's that ethical principle. Finally, the fourth and the highest is the divine principle, is the divine motivation, that which transcends all the preceding three, which makes all the preceding three redundant in as far as all that what was spoken about now, including that what was considered to be the highest moral compass of ethical orientation, because the divine law here is what overthrows this, or rather reabsorbs all this into itself, into the realm of utter and entire non-duality, or utter and entire unification of all its principles, where the very concepts of good and evil find naturally equiposed in that what prior to that served as that tension, as that resonance, giving traction to our actions, because these actions are steeped in the traction which takes place in the first, where the moral itself, attitude rising directly from our emotional predisposition, and it is colored by the emotional energy. In that transcendental field, where the divine law now being at play, none of this bears any significance any longer. It is only from that place that our responses, we could say, are accurate in terms of anything that we partake or witness. Anything that falls short of that will always be colored by the aforementioned three stages. And of course, we know when it is colored by personal, then that breeds further and deeper separation, because it is steeped in egotistical, egoic desires for self-gratification. So this is, I think, a quite plain and not really requires much to understand. So what of good and evil in terms of our current world? The world that often being dubbed as meta-modern one, that new term, Metamodernism, that has entered the lexicon of the analysts, art critics, and historians. And just a footnote, obviously this is a continued play on the previous two terms, modernism and postmodernism. Modernism is the reality, the historical reality, since the age of industrial revolution, since perhaps a renaissance where we have become overcome by the notion of being the almighty, powerful beings, independent. All this was propped by scientific breakthroughs, leading all the way into the early to the first half of the 20th century. That advance of the industrial revolution and scientific breakthroughs kind of gave us that euphoria that we stand on the brink of almost becoming God-like beings, in a sense of decoding the last thoughts of God. However, this euphoria, this utopia didn't last forever. Then came an ugly reality of the Second World War, and disillusioned in all that what was considered to be as extraordinary achievement of human race, of human spirit, of human mind, was given a very different view from now on. So instead of the unified single axis of total trust into the capacity of a human being, human beings in terms of casting out its own future, navigating its reality. Remember that, just few figures in the history of humankind, and Albert Einstein just saying just last bit left before the theory of it all, unified theory. This psychologist like Sigmund Freud, who was speaking of knowing what is motivating all human behavior, being very close to declaring that the map of human psyche is being laid out. And the examples may be given many, because this was the euphoria brought about by the late 19th, early 20th century, where that trust into our powers was so incredibly unquestioned and unchecked that we could be forgiven for thinking that indeed there was something extraordinary, that indeed we are on the verge of colonizing space and living in the world, which will be basically free of any suffering, free of any disease, free of any illness, free of any inequality. And the hard landing of what the World War II has brought the greatest disillusionment into these utopian perspectives, which in turn brought collapse of collectively shared values, collapse of moral conduct, collapse of any ideas of unity. Instead, the nihilism, polyvalent theories, various kind of fragmentations of society continuously were brought into the focal point of our awareness in terms of where we're heading as society, with the main slogan that nobody knows where we're heading. We're not heading anywhere. So this is the characteristics of the post-modernity, the characteristic of postmodernism. And now, Metamodernism, yet another term which at times also spoken of as postmodernism, where attempts were made to reconcile that nihilistic, sarcastic outlook in disbelief in anything with a newly born offshoots of that, taking the moral stand and the moral value, taking this certain kind of consciously adopted a rosy perspective on how we could be as a society, as humans, which perhaps underlines and characterizes that meta-modernism in terms of its input when it comes to a shared consensus of us, in terms of, again, that critical historical analysis and perspective. So how does that concept of good and evil being viewed in our current day of meta-world, meta-modernism? Well, this certainly has great possibilities that we are now ready to reawaken from the nightmare of that realization that the mid of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, which is still characterized by a lot of euphoria until it was all crushed by the rise of the totalitarian systems, by the rise of fascism, by the rise of the Nazism, by all these tyrannies that were prevalent autocratic systems in the world. What this disillusionment brought as the fragmentation, and what the historians and philosophers were speaking to as that constatation of facts rather than bringing any alternative perspectives. And what is now being born into the world again is that possibility that we can reconcile these horrors of the past in the light of great understanding of who we are. And of course, all the spiritual movement, all the attempts by all beings out there, as I speak, are always directed towards that end. There are a number of very gifted spiritual teachers, historians, psychologists, and political commentators as well, who prefer to give a more all-encompassing analysis to that what good and evil stands for here, so that we can take a collective responsibility to what is happening in the world and to the world, because the world doesn't exist outside of our projected perspective. The world that we experience out there is always held by the sum total of our projected perspectives. It simply has no reality of its own. These are the quantum physics. This is the quantum real, and we cannot deny that. We can no longer rest upon any solidity of the Newtonian mechanics, where it was very easy to say that evil is over there and goodness is here. Instead, it's a much more interchangeable, much more interconnected, integral picture, where good and evil are these polarities that eager to reconcile themselves in the light of greater awareness of who we are. So let that, what here presents itself as the final frontier, being met by each and every one of us in full responsibility of what it takes to go beyond good and evil, because this is truly who we are as earthlings on this planet at this very moment and always.